Vladimir Putin ended February responding to NATO's war provocations. Of course, his speech to the Federal Assembly in Russia comes as the election, the general election, the presidential election in Russia is just weeks away. But in many ways, Vladimir Putin's speech, a 2-hour-long speech to the Federal Assembly, mind you, was a response to Emmanuel Macron's provocations, NATO's provocations, and of course, the ongoing military aggression, encirclement campaign, and war that the United States and NATO are building up against Russia. And so Vladimir Putin created this speech and outlined in this speech Russia's overall trajectories, but his response, the overall trajectory for Russia coming into 2024 and beyond. But his response that got the most attention, of course, was the warnings that he sent to NATO about what it would mean for example, Emmanuel Macron's wishes for NATO troops to fight Russia, what it would mean for NATO, that this is existential, not just for Russia, but also for NATO itself, that this is a suicide course. And so here is a clip that has gotten the most attention. Okay, so this has got the most attention. Here's a little bit of a transcript, but let's just go right to the video, okay? And I will read the English if there is no voiceover. So here we go.
Запад спровоцировал конфликт на Украине, на Ближнем Востоке, в других.
The West provoked the conflict in Ukraine, the Middle East, and other regions of the world, and continues to lie.
Регионах мира и продолжает лгать. Теперь вот без всякого смущения заявляют.
Now, without any embarrassment, they claim that Russia is allegedly planning to attack Europe.
Что Россия якобы намеревается напасть на Европу. Ну просто мы же.
We all understand that this is nonsense.
Понимаем, это несут бред просто какой-то. А при этом сами выбирают.
At the same time, they themselves choose the most effective means of defeat to strike on our territory.
Цели для нанесения ударов по нашей территории выбирают наиболее эффективные, как они думают, средства поражения.
They started talking about sending NATO military contingents to Ukraine, a direct reference to Macron.
Или о возможности отправки на Украину натовских военных контингентов. Но мы помним.
But we remember the fate of those who once sent their contingents to our territory, talking about World War II in particular.
Судьбу тех, кто направлял когда-то свои контингенты на территорию нашей страны. Но теперь.
But now the consequences for possible interventions will be much more tragic.
Последствия для возможных интервентов будут гораздо более трагичны. Они должны, в конце концов, понимать.
In the end, they must understand that we also have weapons, and they know this. So here's the warnings. And mind you, there was a thunderous applause when he said there will be a high price to pay.
Что у нас тоже есть оружие, да знают об этом. Сейчас только я сказал, тоже есть оружие, которое.
As I've just said, we also have weapons that can strike targets on their territory.
Может поражать цели на их территории. И что все они?
What are they up to now? What are they scaring the world with?
Придумывают сейчас, чем пугают весь мир, что все это.
That all this is a real threat to the conflict with the use of nuclear weapons, which means the destruction of civilization. Nuclear weapons.
Реально грозит конфликтом с использованием ядерного оружия, а значит уничтожением цивилизации. Они чего этого не понимают?
Do they understand this? No, they don't, Vladimir Putin. They do not understand this, or they choose not to understand, I think is a better way to look at it.
Это люди, знаете, это люди, которые.
These are people who have not gone through difficult trials. They have already forgotten what war is. What an incredible point to make. All of those, from Emmanuel Macron to Joe Biden to Olaf Scholz, all of the major leaders, and also all of the major military leaders of these countries have no idea what the consequences of war really is. This is a point that has been made for a long time, especially about the United States. No idea what war really is, because either the United States has been going around the world with its superior military, destroying other countries much weaker than it, destroying them in ways where the costs for the United States, at least in terms of manpower and lives, was relatively small comparatively, and where the effects at home could be masked in many significant ways due to the changing character of warfare. But Vladimir Putin is saying here that Russia understands, because it wasn't so many generations ago, and arguably they definitely understand now in the conflict in Ukraine what the cost of war really is.
Не прошли через тяжелые испытания. Они уже забыли, что такое война. Вот мы, даже наше сегодняшнее поколение,
We and even our current generation have gone through such difficult trials during the fight against international terrorism in the Caucasus. So Scott Ritter has been on here talking about this too, especially Chechnya, for example. I mean, there have been Russia has been fighting wars. Russia had to fight a war with Georgia. Russia had to fight a war in Chechnya. Russia, of course, World War II. Everyone knows what Russia had to go through. So, this doesn't even count all of the major provocations that could have led to nuclear war during the Cold War. So, Russia knows what war is.
прошли вот через такие тяжелые испытания во время борьбы с международным терроризмом на Кавказе. Сейчас в условиях конфликта на Украине то же самое происходит. Они думают, что для них это все мультики какие-то.
This is all a cartoon from them. They're doing it in Ukraine, he said. This is all a cartoon from them. So that caught the attention of many people, but it definitely caught the attention of the BBC. So we're just going to listen to that really quick. It's a very quick segment, because the BBC had this to say about it, and then I'll show you what Politico had to say about it. So here we go. So here's what BBC had to say.
It was President Putin's 19th State of the Nation address.
Спасибо, прошу вас.
And he used it to send this warning to Western nations. Don't send your troops to Ukraine.
Они должны, в конце концов, понимать, что у нас тоже есть оружие.
They need to understand, once and for all, that we have weapons too, that can strike targets on their territory. And everything they think up and scare the world with risks a nuclear conflict and the end of civilization.
Regarding Russia, he pledged to reduce poverty, boost the birth rate, and raise incomes. Well, there is an election coming up.
The cynicism of the Western mainstream media, the Russophobia, is just off the wall. Because on the one hand, they cover the warning that Putin rightfully gave to NATO about the threat of nuclear conflict. It's a good warning. They should heed that warning. But then at the end, Putin says that they're going to raise incomes, reduce poverty. Oh, it's all about the election, right? That's all it is about. As if Russia hasn't been doing that, even over the last couple of years, trying to stave off the impact of sanctions and doing quite a good job in raising the livelihoods of people despite economic warfare leveled by the collective West. Still, it's cynicism, right? It's just all cynicism. It's all to paint a negative picture, a picture of Russia that is wholly negative, and one where we can feel good about hating Russia. And so the Western mainstream media, there you're seeing just 20 seconds, subtle ways in which the Western mainstream media goes along with the provocations from NATO countries, right? It's in the pockets. It is completely subservient to the neocon foreign policy establishment that needs to heed Putin's warning. So here you have the BBC reporting on Putin's warning, and then going along with the very reason, going along with the very attempt by the collective West, which to wage this possible nuclear conflict that has lent itself to Putin needing to give a warning in the first place. So it's just shows. I mean, we're just seeing how absolutely desperate NATO is, the United States, these elites are in provoking this conflict with Russia. So friend of the show, Scott Ritter, was on Sputnik and had a great short summary of the speech overall, because I want to get away from the cynicism and move into why this speech was also important, not just as a warning to NATO, but also as a corrective to the absolutely cacophonous rhetoric we are hearing from the Western mainstream media about how dangerous Russia is. Because on the one hand, Russia has nuclear weapons, but I'll show you later that not even NATO believes that Russia is going to use nuclear weapons preemptively. There's no evidence of that. So here's what Scott Ritter had to say. He will be back on the show very soon, and I'll give you that announcement soon. But here we go.
Here, the priorities of Russia appear to be related to Russia's strategic nuclear deterrence and Russia's role in the world today. Vladimir Putin's address to Parliament came on the heels of a meeting in Europe hosted by French President Emmanuel Macron, where there was a discussion about the potential of NATO nations entering into unilateral agreements with Ukraine to provide conventional military forces to Ukraine. Russia has said since the beginning of the special military operation that the deployment of NATO conventional forces into Ukraine would be a red line that would lead to not just the possibility, but the probability of direct conflict between Russia and NATO, which would more than likely end up being a general nuclear war. Fortunately, the majority of NATO nations who received Emmanuel Macron's suggestion rejected it out of hand because they understand the consequences. But that being said, it's somewhat disturbing that European nations and the United States continue to believe that Ukraine is a playground upon which they get to engage in activities designed to achieve the strategic defeat of Russia. And this is the important part of what Vladimir Putin's speech to Parliament emphasized. There will be no strategic defeat of Russia. Russia has built a very capable strategic nuclear deterrent that includes a variety of new weapon systems, nuclear powered cruise missiles, the Sarmat heavy strategic intercontinental ballistic missile, and the avant-garde hypersonic delivery system. All of these are new. They have no Western equivalent, and all are designed to defeat any Western defenses, missile defenses or otherwise, that could exist. All of these weapons guarantee that any nation that seeks to engage in a strategic conflict with Russia, a nuclear conflict with Russia, will not prevail.
Boom. And they're not going to prevail. NATO, in the United States in particular, does not have as many nuclear weapons as Russia. You might wonder, wow, Danny, why does Russia have so many nuclear weapons? That is the most in the world. Why? Well, do you remember the Cold War? There were numerous threats of nuclear war during the Cold War. The Soviet Union was forced to build nuclear weapons. And then, of course, after the Soviet Union fell, it wasn't so long until the Wolfowitz Doctrine came around and the neocons started talking about balkanizing all of Russia, not just the Soviet Union, which had already been balkanized, right? All of the Caucasus states, the Baltic states, etc., delinked from the Soviet Union, supposedly independent now, although if you look at any one of these countries from Estonia to Lithuania, you wouldn't think of them as independent at all. But nonetheless, Russia has been targeted ever since, even during the early period of the fall of the Soviet Union. That's when the Wolfowitz Doctrine was released. So there's not going to be a strategic defeat of Russia because Russia has been preparing for this for many, many, many years.
While Russia may not be able to survive whatever retaliation these nations put forward, one thing is for certain: no nation will survive any effort to achieve the strategic defeat of Russia. Which brings us to the last and perhaps final part of Vladimir Putin's presentation to the Russian parliament. The idea of Russia as a nation of equal status in the world today. Russia is not a second rate power. Russia is not a second class citizen on the global stage. Russia is a major power that possesses a unique culture, a unique civilization. Russia is a nation that has earned its place in the world today. Indeed, according to Vladimir Putin, the world cannot exist without the Russian nation. And therefore, it's time for the United States, for Europe, for NATO, for all nations of the world to understand that Russia is here to stay. Russia is a part of the global community. And anybody who seeks to change this reality to achieve the strategic defeat of Russia is simply entering on a one-way trip to hell.
So that one-way trip to hell is outside of my window right now, as you can hear passing by. But that's exactly right. Russia is a nation of equal status. That's where the cynicism can be replaced by a new kind of optimism, one where these warnings should be seen not as dangerous, because some who don't know or understand the relationships of power, the balance of forces in the world, might say, ooh, scary. Vladimir Putin is warning of potential nuclear war. What if Putin in Russia decides to just preemptively wage it? Well, what Scott Ritter is saying, what I've said here many times on this channel, that's not the imperative for Russia. Russia and Putin, when they warn about these red lines being crossed, what the warnings actually say is that Russia is a nation of equal status to the United States, to any country in the world, and it will be treated as such, or lest there's a major great power conflict, which does not really have an example in history to compare to. That is what Vladimir Putin was saying in that speech, that there is a possible conflict that could be ignited by NATO's actions, which will lead to more disastrous consequences than in prior periods when the United States, when Germany, etc., have tried to provoke and ultimately wage war on Russia's soil. You got to remember, the United States sent 10,000 troops to the Soviet Union in 1918 in an attempt to overthrow the Soviet Union, backing the so-called whites, those forces that were wholly against the establishment of the Soviet Union. And of course, there was World War II, where while the United States was supposedly on the Allied side, it had waited for Germany to power up in an attempt, in a hope that it would destroy the Soviet Union before Germany just started to destroy the rest of Europe, and of course, maybe set its sights on the United States. The United States sat on its perch thousands of miles away, waiting and hoping for the mutual destruction. So, nonetheless, that's the history. This is why Russia now is not going to be pushed around, and that these warnings should be heeded. From the news about Germany's leaked audio, the Air Force leaking their secrets that they are going to plan an attack on the Crimea Bridge for Ukraine, with Ukraine, and it's in a system in crossing that red line, or whether it's Emmanuel Macron being so confident and doubling down on this notion that NATO troops should be considered in Ukraine at some point in the very near future to confront Russia. All of this just shows how the hubris of the collective West is so enormous that it is willing to toe that line, to flirt with the potential of a nuclear conflict, just so it can serve Washington's geopolitical and imperial interests. Its interests primarily are to destabilize and weaken Russia. Everything it has done to do that has backfired, especially in regard to this now 2+ into the third year of this proxy war in Ukraine. Russia is getting stronger. Vladimir Putin, his speeches, his interview with Tucker Carlson, all of it shows that actually Russia is getting more confident, that it is not getting less confident, it is getting more confident in itself to stand up to the collective West, to demand it be treated equally. And that is the world historic moment that we live in, where these warnings, some people say, well, Russia and China too, both of these countries, while they may be charting a multipolar world, they're far too soft on the collective West. And I would push back on that and say, just by warning, just by demonstrating the ability to stand up, even verbally, right? Politics is about a lot more than just firing off weapons, than being aggressive and attempting to meet force with force. It's also about how you strategically, politically, ideologically maneuver on a stage that is being set by a confluence of forces that are not always in your favor, and how you follow the art of war, right? How you follow the art of war in many different avenues will ultimately determine whether you are victorious or whether you ultimately meet defeat. And I argue that Russia and China are playing chess while the United States is playing checkers. The United States is trying to just stack the checker chips on the world stage, take it all, and leave everyone with nothing. Russia and China are playing a long game of preservation for their own national interests, and also for the interests of long-held principles that ultimately lead to the progression of a multipolar world of peaceful development and of prosperity, not just for Russia and China, but for the rest of the world. So that is far different from the United States and NATO's imperatives, their interests. And just by being able to warn, just by being able to demonstrate that they have the capabilities of defending, striking back of potential attacks, it makes NATO, it makes the United States think twice about actually doing them. That is the art of war. It's a huge part of war, is being able to show you have the capabilities so that your enemy knows, or your adversary, your so-called adversary knows, that if you mess around, if you F around, then you're going to find out. And that should not be seen as a bad thing or soft, right? I see some people sometimes say, Danny, these two countries, they should just end it with the United States. They should just put the United States, the neocons, out of their misery. No, that's not how this thing would work anyway. Because as we have seen throughout recent history, just in the last 2+ years, into the third year of this conflict, it is not Russia and China that cannot be trusted. It's the collective West. The collective West, we cannot rely on the collective West impulse control. They don't really have it. At any point, you have forces within the establishment across the collective West, especially in Washington, that are itching for an excuse to do the unthinkable with Russia and China, and be damned the consequences. So we have to reiterate, we have to reinforce that warnings are not just enough, but they are messages coming from someone like Vladimir Putin, which should be heeded. The interests of peace, the interests of peaceful development, the interests of prosperity for all, not just the tiny few, these principles, these interests are ultimately only met when these warnings are heeded. When the road to hell, which NATO and the United States and the collective West are on, is not followed, that we take ourselves off of that road. And so Putin's warning in this speech, this 2-hour speech, which also included many details of corridors that Russia's building, of integrating with the world economy, of building this multipolar world, with all that optimism, right? Improving the standard of living of Russian people. All that optimism, of course, was ignored. And all we got was, well, Russia is potentially going to wage nuclear war against the West. But Even Politico, right after the speech, right after basically every single Western mainstream media outlet had declared that Vladimir Putin is going to wage nuclear war on the West, here you have Putin's bluffing on nukes, say top NATO official. We don't see any imminent threat of Russia using these weapons, said the military alliance's deputy secretary general. NATO's number 2 official said Russian President Vladimir Putin's nuclear threat is currently just psychological intimidation. Putin issued the warning Thursday as French President Emmanuel Macron stood by his message that the West could not rule out sending troops to help Ukraine fend off Putin's full-scale invasion. This really threatens a conflict with nuclear weapons, said Putin. But NATO Secretary General Deputy Mircea Gionia, sorry, I can't pronounce that name, characterized Putin's nuclear saber rattling as a discourse that delves into the logic of psychological intimidation rather than real intentions, he said in an interview with the Spanish newspaper El País, published Friday. We do not see any imminent threat of Russia using nuclear weapons, but these statements are in themselves very dangerous because they erode trust. Russia knows the consequences of taking such a step. So again, this is how they do it. They admit the truth, which is that Russia has no interest in using these nuclear weapons, but they always paint it as Russia's making a huge error, Russia's making a mistake, Russia is still an aggressor, Russia knows better, right? A lot of this finger wagging at Russia when the big message out of that is that even NATO understands Russia's true position, and they are just more interested in distorting it for their own aims. So Vladimir Putin sent a major warning to NATO, one that was not just warranted, but one that should be heeded. France, Germany, the United States, and the rest of the NATO so-called alliance need to go on a course corrective. Really, they need to cease to exist as a so-called military alliance. But in lieu of that, it is very important that we point out that these warnings should be heeded, that there should be a course corrective, that it is NATO in the United States that are provoking a possible nuclear conflict, and that Ukraine is just one part of this, and a major part, one that has exposed all the fissures, all the weaknesses, all the deficits of the United States and its fledgling empire. Well, an empire that is fast on course to collapse. And that is the reason why Putin had to send a warning in the first place. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.